Joining me now on the Knicks Film School Podcast, he is a podcaster, much like myself, of the Bulls. So perfect timing as the Knicks just played a game against the Bulls. They are going to play another game against the Bulls. The first time the Knicks have played back-to-back games against the same opponent this year. You can hear his takes on the Bulls HQ pod, another proud member of the Blue Wire podcast network, which we are now happy to say that we are part of that family. Welcome to the show, Mark Karantzoulis. How you doing, Mark?
Good, Jonathan. I'm happy to be on, mate. Haven't been on a Knicks podcast before, but obviously happy to talk Bulls Knicks. But as a side piece, welcome to the Blue Wire network, mate. That's cool as.
Thank you. And anytime I could do a podcast where somebody calls me mate, it's a good day for me. So thank you for that. I don't have a ton of guests. I think it's just, it might just be Jack with the Strickland, I think. Anyway, so thank you for that. It's about the warmest welcome that I could foresee getting.
No worries.
So you're down in Melbourne. So thank you again for doing this. It's 9 a.m. by you. I guess let's just, we'll get right into it. Before we get into the LaVine stuff, which I know everybody wants to really hear about, and we'll touch on Tibbs and Rose and everything, you just watched this game like I did. So what are I'm always curious to get outside perspectives of the Knicks from people who don't live and die with them every day. So what do you think of the team after just watching them?
Well, to be fair, I haven't watched much Knicks basketball over the last few years, to be honest with you. But
you ain't missing much.
Yeah, well, let's figure. That's why I haven't really tuned in, I suppose. But I have been watching this season a little bit when I can. I mean, my main focus is the Bulls, and that's where I spend probably 95% of my time. But when I'm flicking around, looking at other games on League Pass and those sorts of things, I have been drawn to the Knicks for a couple of reasons. One, because of Tibbs and his connection, obviously, to my Bulls. And I mean, there's some Bulls fans who maybe don't have such fond memories of Tom Thibodeau, but I'm not one of them. I'm still a Tibbs fan, let's say. So that's one element of it all. But the fact that the team has actually been competent, has been good, has been fun in times as well. That's another reason why I've been drawn to watch more Knicks games than I have in the past. So it's actually been fun this season to see the Bulls and Knicks both sort of getting off the canvas, let's say, and actually, well, I won't go back and say they're completely back to full relevancy yet, because it's only, 4 weeks into the season, a month into the season, but they look more competent at least. And they're more fun and more fun for the fans who, for a number of years now, have had to root for some pretty bad teams and some bad organizations. So I'm hoping for both teams that it's better days ahead.
Well, I mean, it's interesting because the two teams, I think, in a lot of ways mirror each other. If you go back over the last 35 years, other than the fact that one team has 6 championships and the other team has 0 championships. But I mean, no, if you think about it, both organizations drafted a transcendent player in the early 80s, were, two of the top, 4 or 5 forces to be reckoned with in the league over the course of the 90s. And then for most of the last 20 years have been somewhere between irrelevant and embarrassing, with the exception of one stretch of time in the middle of the last 2 decades. Again, you guys better than us. The Tibbs regime was longer and the heights were higher. You made it to an Eastern Conference Finals. One Eastern Conference Finals, right? I'm not forgetting one?
Yeah.
Okay. Just the one. And then, we didn't make it quite that far, but and now here they are with 2 new regimes, 2 new coaches who are universally respected around the league, even if people do have their qualms about them. So it's kind of funny that we do find ourselves in this spot. I thought it was a good game, by the way, the other night. It was the most frustrating Knicks game of the season for me, because I don't know. I mean, that was the other thing I'm curious. Just off of that game, what did you think of the performance that the Knicks put forth?
Well, look, like I said, I haven't watched every single Knicks game, but I felt like the Knicks should have probably won this game if they could actually create some offense in the half court. I mean, they couldn't buy a 3-point shot, and the Bulls were giving up a lot of 3-point attempts, or at least giving up the attempts that the Knicks got were some decent looks as well. But for whatever reason, the Knicks just couldn't make those shots. So I was actually thinking,
because they're a bad shooting team.
Well, yeah, I suppose. I didn't want to go that far.
You can listen. We're all friends here.
Yeah,
just being honest.
I suppose. But I mean, the shots that the Bulls were giving up, shots that you don't necessarily want to give up. They were good, clean looks, but the Knicks just couldn't make it. So they were fortunate, the Bulls, in a sense, because there wasn't much going on beyond Lauri Markkanen's offense for the first 3 quarters. Zach LaVine wasn't doing much. Kobe White was just a complete train wreck. So there was a lane there for the Knicks to really win this game, I suppose, if they could just score in the half court. But the offense in the half court looked so bad at times that it just allowed the Bulls to stay in it. And then surprisingly, the Bulls, I don't know why or how, because I'm not used to seeing it, but they actually closed in the clutch for a change. So I'm not used to seeing that. But it was an interesting game. I felt like the Knicks probably should have won it, to be honest with you, if they just had a little bit better offense. But to your point, the offense has, as it's been the case most of the season, I think they're bottom 5 in offensive rating, if I'm not mistaken.
We are.
It's just tough to watch maybe in the half court.
It's, like Tibbs, as I'm sure you remember, is just, he's all about, like, is it the right play, right? Did you make the right play? And I think his issues with that game came in the first and third quarters when the Knicks were just kind of like, they weren't late. It's not like they lacked energy on defense, but they were just, I don't know, what would you call it? They were a little sluggish on defense. Like there was a zip of verve missing. And then by the time we finally, they figured out how to shut the Bulls offense down, they were doing a little bit more of that trapping or whatever you want to call it with Noel coming up high. They couldn't get that big bucket. So yeah, that was unfortunate. Fortunate for you guys though. And listen, if we're dealing with like general karma, if any team deserved a win after the previous game that you guys had in Portland, I think it's the Bulls.
That was a tough loss, but at the same time, like when Lillard hit that shot, a lot of Bulls fans had different reactions, but I was just laughing because it's just like, all right,
it's
you're going to lose like that. Like, what are you meant to do? I'm not going to be angry. Like that was just an absurd shot. But yeah, I don't know. I felt like this could have been a Knicks win. Just, maybe if RJ hits one more shot. If
he had a couple chances. Yeah.
Yeah, if Quickly maybe hits one more 3 or Austin Rivers or Alec Burks. I mean, Alec Burks hit a tough 3 towards the end of the game anyway. But it just felt like they were just 1 or 2 shots short of maybe getting the win. And it was kind of frustrating from that point of view from the Bulls because it really was only Lauri Markkanen, at least in the first half and up until that third quarter, really doing anything. But to your point, at once the Knicks sort of figured it out defensively and the Bulls have a tendency to maybe not necessarily reward the hot hand. It felt like it was going to be a Knicks win, but like I said, randomly the Bulls figured it out.
Last thing on the game and just of your impressions on the team, it's always difficult for me personally to fairly and accurately assess a new exciting player because there's just so much newness and so much excitement. So like right now, to me, Emmanuel Quickly is, I don't know. I'm starting to look for hotel reservations in Springfield for I guess 2039 for the Hall of Fame induction. We think he's really good here. What do you have any takeaways just from watching him from a game?
He looks really good, man. I mean, he looks really good. I don't ultimately know what his ideal role is, what his career scope will be, and those sorts of things. It's probably too early to go in from that point of view. But in terms of the value that you've got from him as a draft pick or as a first year player, at least a rookie point of view, I mean, he looks like he looks the goods, I guess. And this is the type of player teams like the Bulls and Knicks sort of need to pick up on the periphery type thing. If you can, I mean, you're going to have your standard avenues of improving your team, but if you can still find pieces with lesser assets, let's say, or through other avenues, it just completely remodels a rebuild, let's say. So Quickly looking this good has been a surprise to me, but a welcome surprise. He looks very good. He looked very good yesterday. I mean, like I said, he could have probably made 1 or 2 more shots, but at the same time, he hit that huge 3 towards the back end of the game as well.
Yeah, it was pretty big.
But I think Tibbs is actually a really good coach for him as well. Tibbs has had a lot of success with those sort of scoring guards, particularly those coming off the bench. So in that way, I know there's probably some Knicks fans who are probably frustrated that maybe Alfred Payton's starting, that maybe Quickly's not playing enough minutes and those sorts of things. But to me, at least, I've seen it on the Twitter sphere, let's say
5 or 6, yeah.
Yeah, but to me, I think he's coming along the right way, and Tibbs is using him the right way. Sorry. Yep. And as we sort of get through the season, I would imagine the reliance on someone like Quickly will just sort of increase. So yeah, he looks the goods, and I think the Knicks found a player there for sure.
I guess that's probably a good transition because two guys that have been, I don't say in the news, but two names that have been linked to the Knicks are over the last several weeks. And actually with LaVine, it's been, well, actually, no, with both players, because Derrick Rose already played for the Knicks 4 years ago. And I think Ian Begley, who we mentioned before, first dropped his first report about, the Knicks and at the time the Nets keeping tabs on LaVine. I don't know how many months ago it was. I felt like it was sometime early in the offseason. So not new news, and I don't even know if it's news. I mean, as Ian said, it's like there's a lot of teams keeping tabs on a lot of guys, and LaVine's a name, so it gets out there. Everybody wants to hear about LaVine, so let's just get into him. My take on this. Well, I think there's two conversations. There's LaVine the player, which I'll save that for 1 second and it's related, and there's LaVine the trade asset, if he is even a trade asset, which is where I kind of am of the opinion that, like, why are the Bulls trading him unless it's a package that's too good to be true? And if you're a team like the Knicks or any other team for that matter, is LaVine the guy you want to make the Godfather offer to? So I guess I'll start off by asking, is there a world where you think trading Zach LaVine would be wise for the Bulls? And if so, what would that world look like?
Yeah, so, I mean, I definitely have the opinion that the Bulls probably shouldn't trade Zach LaVine, but he's also not good enough to make or to deem untouchable, let's say. So I think there is a world where it is possible that he could be moved. I'm not sure if that makes sense to move him to the Knicks or the Nets, as sort of Ian Begley sort of alluded to in a column he wrote, I think on the weekend at least, or a few days ago. So, I mean, there is a world where Zach LaVine could be traded for a good haul, let's say, particularly if the Bulls decided to maybe reboot the rebuild. But given that they're almost playing 500 basketball, I don't know if we're in that world right now. For me, at least, I'm of the opinion that the growth that Zach LaVine has showed this year is to the point where he's sort of playing at a top 30, top 40 player level.
That's it?
Look, he may be higher
than that.
Potentially. He could be higher than that, but maybe I'm being a little conservative because I want to see a little bit more of a sample of this, let's say.
Well, what are your critiques of his game this year? Because I think this is what a lot of people are really curious about. The perception is that he's a poor defender and he sometimes makes poor decisions. Does that still hold water?
It's still true. Those elements of his games are still problematic at times. They've definitely improved to a degree. There's still problems, but the fact that the rest of his offensive game has just sort of stepped up to the next level, like, I'm not super concerned with those elements of his game, but I mean, it's to be fair and to critiquing fairly, but they are still problem areas that he needs to work on. But I mean, he's grown so much this season and he's been so damn good. I mean, he's almost a 50-40-90 guy this season, averaging close to 27, 28 points per game. I mean, he's just an offensive maestro at this point. So he's 26 next month. I'm of the opinion that I don't want to go through the Jimmy Butler scenario again, where you trade a good player, a guy who's not, he's not Jimmy Butler. He's not that good, but he's at least, emerging as a potential all-star type player. I don't want to trade that player and sort of go into another reboot of the rebuild, let's say. But I don't know, maybe things go haywire from here on out. Maybe the Bulls just lose their next 10 games. Maybe LaVine, for whatever reason, just doesn't look great. And the new regime here in Chicago decides to maybe reboot that rebuild with, the 2021 draft looking pretty strong. Maybe that's a scenario where Zach LaVine is maybe traded at that point. But personally, I'm struggling to see that scenario emerging at this point. I wouldn't want to see that, and I'd rather see them sort of maybe not build around Zach LaVine, but try to build with Zach LaVine and add another piece or two around him and try to be a respectable 45, 50 win team, or like a Portland East, let's say.
I'm happy you made a small distinction there, because I feel like a lot of times there's a perception that, like, oh, we can't build around this player. Well, you may not need to build around this player. You may just have to build with this player. And there's I feel like there's a lot of lanes to team building, and we're kind of dealing with the same thing here right now, where I think most Knicks fans are thinking like you in terms of Julius Randle. Like, yeah, there's a segment of Knicks fans who are like, trade him, let's tank, get a haul of assets and will worsen our position or increase our position for the draft. But I think most people are like you. Let's just ride this thing out and try to get good, especially given how bad things have been for a while. Which is why I think if they, for Julius Randle, I think if any team came calling for him, not that I necessarily think they are, but like I would hope the Knicks would ask for a haul and a half. So I feel like there's always a conversation around LaVine as far as, okay, what role does he play on a good team? Even that conversation I feel like is a little bit fraught because there's things like, oh, well, he can't be the leading scorer. Well, just because you're not the most important player doesn't mean you may not still be the leading scorer. Like, where do you see him fitting in? Let's just, hypothetically speaking, the next great Bulls team.
Yeah, I think that's kind of the problem as well, and part of the reason why some of the fan base want to trade LaVine is the fact that they don't view him as a number one guy. And to be fair, I mean that is fair. I mean, he's not the best player on a legitimate team. That's not his role. He's miscast in Chicago as the number one option. And for that reason, a lot of fans want to trade him. They don't want to necessarily pay him his max deal, which is very similar to the arguments that were being made 4 or 5 years ago with Jimmy Butler. So it is sort of history repeating for us at the moment. But to answer your question, I mean, his best role, he may not be the best player on the team. He may not even be the second best player on the team, but he may be the second best offensive player on the team, to the point where I think if you put him next to a natural creator, someone who can run the offense and just allow Zach to sort of be that secondary creator, to focus on his scoring, to focus on what he does well, then I think the narrative around LaVine, the perception about Zach LaVine would be completely different. I mean, I think about someone like Jamal Murray and how lucky he has been in a sense to be put next to someone like Nikola Jokic, rather than just being put on a team like the Bulls or the Knicks, where you're forced to being that sole creator, that lead creator, and maybe you're less efficient. Maybe you're more exposed as an offensive player, but playing in Denver next to someone like Jokic, where you can just do your thing and be that scoring guard and secondary creator, the perception of you as a player is completely different. And it's similar for someone like Donovan Mitchell as well. Like, you get drafted into a team like Utah, who's not tanking necessarily. Yeah. You've got good vets all around you. Mm-hmm. You come in and winning straight away. Again, that perception of you is very different compared to someone like Zach, who has just been on crappy teams ever since he's entered the league. The perception of him is still negative by a lot of people. He's fighting against that. I just wonder if he had been put into a different situation a lot earlier, if the perception of him as a player, the narrative around him as a player would be completely different. So put him next to a Jokic, put him with LeBron, put him with a Luka Doncic. I mean, we're talking about a guy who's talked a lot differently, let's say.
I was about to say, it's such a subtle point that I think when we think about and talk about, not to go off on a tangent, I apologize for this, but when we think about and talk about like great players in this league, it's what makes and I think you named the three, and I'm trying to think if there's another one, Jokic, LeBron, Luka, who not only are they great individually, but they will amplify the talents of essentially anyone you put next to them. Mm-hmm. And I don't know. I mean, I get Curry's an obvious one. I forgot him. Duh.
Chris Paul. I mean, that was my big thing in the offseason. I wanted the Bulls to trade for Chris Paul and do what the Suns did. So I thought he would have been great for Zach LaVine. But
Durant, in fairness, Durant has to go in that conversation. I think that's pretty much it. And maybe we get some young guys that like eventually get to that point. And I guess Dame, out of respect, we should probably go in there too. But even him, he's a guy who he wants to have the ball, and I feel like that's maybe why Portland has never gotten to that next level. And that's not a knock on Dame. It's just like this is like the rarest of air. So I completely agree with you. And I think the nice thing for you guys is I think it's easier to turn LaVine into that piece than it may be to turn Randle into that piece, because LaVine is such a deadly shooter and can do does he still cut a lot? I remember he used to cut a lot and like get opportune baskets that way too.
Yeah. So again, like coming back to like the whole perception of Zach, like he's a willing cutter. He's really good off the ball. He moves off the ball. He's more than happy to share the offensive load. The issue in Chicago has been there just hasn't been someone to justify him going off ball. We don't have really another offensive threat like him on the perimeter. So why would you put Zach LaVine off ball and in years past allow Chris Dunn just to pound the ball, let's say? So it never really made sense. So to that point and what we're discussing here, if you had an actual offensive hub running the thing, you could have Zach sort of being that more off-ball role where he would just be absolutely lethal. I mean, a lot of his three-point attempts in Chicago come off the bounce because he's just on the ball so much. But if he was with another equal talent or even a better talent offensively, he could sort of play off ball and just run around like maybe like a Klay Thompson or a Bradley Beal or someone like that, and he would just be even more lethal as an offensive player. So to me, I think he's a fantastic player, and it's probably easier to build around him than someone like Julius Randle, just due to the fact that he's a wing or a guard, whereas Randle is a big. I mean, that irrespective of how good or bad Randle is, and even if Randle and LaVine are equal talents, let's say, the fact that the positional thing is something to consider as well. But
I'm grappling with that actively on a daily basis right now. Like, how good of a passer can Julius Randle be? Because he's not Jokic. And I'm like, I threw out in a newsletter I wrote today, like, comparing him to the early 2000s Chris Webber, but that's even probably too lofty praise because that dude could run an offense by himself. Okay, we have a lot more to talk about, and I don't want to keep you forever. Derrick Rose. Feels like it's been forever since he's been in Chicago. Hell, it feels like it's been forever since he's been in New York. I don't know what there is to say about Derrick Rose, the player, at this point. He is what he is, right? Does he when you watch him now, does he remind you anything of the guy that was in Chicago? Or maybe I should say pre-injury, or let me ask you, is there a difference for you?
Pre-injury, most definitely not. It is nowhere near that. But in terms of the Derrick Rose that we got post all the knee injuries, I thought he's maybe not this season, but maybe the season before, and maybe even before that when he was in Minnesota, he looked better than what he did in Chicago, because I think he was still trying to find himself post ACL, post all the other knee injuries that he's had. How would he evolve in the NBA after those sorts of injuries where all those powers that he did have all had suddenly been sapped type things? So we had a very inefficient Derrick Rose when he came back post all those sort of knee injuries. He had some big moments here and there, but ultimately he didn't look that great, let's say. Whereas I think he sort of found himself as that sort of six-man role where he could sort of just come in and be what he was in Minnesota and Detroit, where I feel like his experience in Chicago, or maybe even New York to a degree after obviously the Bulls traded him to New York, both teams probably didn't get the best version of the new Derrick Rose, if that makes sense. So I could understand why maybe the perception of Derrick Rose to New York now may be met with some trepidation by some Knicks fans, let's say. I know a lot of Bulls fans would love to have Derrick Rose back just due to the fact that he's a Chicago guy. But it's an interesting rumor, no less, given the Thibodeau factor.
I was about to ask because, that came out, and my goodness, you would have thought that that Reggie Miller was going to come out of retirement and play for the Knicks. And here's the thing, I get it, because watching Derrick Rose, no offense to him, but that was a tough year, and the AWOL incident didn't really help, and just like there was an air of like, I don't know, he wasn't bought in, but then again, nobody was bought in that year because it was a friggin' disaster. We don't need to talk about that. So it sounds like though there are still fond memories of him in Chicago with Bulls fans. Does that just have to do with the fact that he won an MVP there and obviously took them to an Eastern Conference Finals, or because I guess that's the part I'm struggling with. We didn't get a version of him where people felt like, oh, this is a good teammate. This is a guy you want in your locker room. This is a guy who, he brings it every night. Like, we didn't. I know I did not come away with that impression from the year he was here. Maybe that's because he was going through some shit, like you said, still kind of figuring out who he was. Are there good vibes still for him in Chicago?
In Chicago, yes. I mean, I'm obviously not on the ground in Chicago, maybe removed from it, so that maybe I have less emotional ties to it. But from the people that I deal with, the people that I speak to, a lot of people obviously would like to see Derrick come back and sort of retire a Bull. I mean, every time some of those Bulls from that sort of 2010 to 2014 era are available, or maybe even retiring, like former Nick Joakim Noah, current Nick Taj Gibson. I mean, there's been a few that have sort of crossed over the lines over to New York.
We love Taj.
Yeah, I mean, Taj is one of my old-timers, but
he's great.
Every time those sorts of guys are sort of seemingly to the back end of their career, we always want them to come back and retire as a Bull, I guess. And the fact that, Derrick being Derrick and he being a former MVP, the youngest MVP, a former Chicago Bull, a Chicago kid, let's say, There's always going to be a large contingent of people that want to see Derrick Rose come back. But at the same time, I completely understand why Knicks fans would have some reservations about Derrick coming back to the Knicks, given your exposure to Derrick, and like we sort of spoke about. Like, I mean, he's trying to find himself on the court, but yeah, to your point, he's probably going on. I completely forgot about that situation where he just went missing for whatever reason. So clearly there was mental stuff going on there as well that he just needed to get right. So I understand why, again, there'd be some trepidation. And I don't know if the Knicks really need Derrick Rose at this point. I mean, you got quickly coming off the bench. You got Austin Rivers as that sort of combo scoring type guard off the bench.
My guess is they would start him and tell Peyton to go. I don't know.
Yeah, I guess that's it.
Keep walking until we tell you to turn around. That's what they're going to do. They're going to put a blindfold on Elfrid Payton and say, take 1,000 paces. But I agree with you. I don't think the Knicks need Derrick Rose, but they need someone better than Elfrid Payton. But again, different conversation for a different day. Let's talk about Tibbs real quick, and then I'll get you out of here. It's funny. From afar, I always remember, listening to people talk about him who I guess cover the Bulls or rooted for the Bulls or whatever, and just people around the league, and opinions were so divisive. And I would look at the results and I'd be like, how in God's name could anybody not love this? I mean, he's doing what he's doing with what he's doing it with. And then Minnesota happened, and we don't need to talk about Minnesota because I think there was a lot going on in that place. And I think I know you probably heard Andrew Wiggins' comments last week about the Timberwolves organization, and he singled out Tibbs as being a positive force. And now he's here, and I'm ready to build a statue for the man. And I know a lot of Knicks fans are ready to build a statue to the man, and that yet there are other people being like, he's ruining everything. Kevin Knox is out of the rotation. Frank Ntilikina is out of the rotation. He's also playing RJ Barrett and Emmanuel Quickly a ton. Mitchell Robinson, he's playing a lot also. So I don't know. What are your what are your impressions of Tibbs as having watched and covered him for as long as you did?
Yeah, I mean, to me, it's still the same old Tibbs, and I say that in both good and bad terms. I mean, the things that, and this will sound extremely cliche, but his biggest strengths are also his weaknesses, and I still see that to this point. I mean, what he does well is he will lift the baseline of this team, and that's why we're seeing the Knicks being so competitive at this point. I mean, you're 9-13 or whatever the record is at this point, close-ish to 500. We're there not that long ago. But he just extracts the best out of pretty much everyone. I don't understand, at least from my vantage point. I mean, I have no investment in someone like Kevin Knox, Frank Ntilikina, maybe even Dennis Smith Jr., maybe a couple others here and there. So I don't really care too much about that. And I don't even know if the current Knicks regime care about them, because they're not necessarily the current regime draft picks, I'd say. Yeah. So is it Tibbs not playing them, or is it, I don't know, is it the current regime maybe not being too invested at them and not necessarily caring if he's not playing them? But I see a lot of the same Thibodeau, and I see in the Knicks a classic Thibodeau team. I mean, I've talked about, quickly being that off-the-bench scoring sort of guard, and we saw a lot of that in Chicago with Nate Robinson, DJ Augustine, even someone like John Lucas, who probably shouldn't even be in the NBA. Tibbs just has a way of finding something with those scoring guards off the bench and just making them look quite good. Julius Randle as that sort of point forward is very reminiscent of Joakim Noah back in 2014, the way you're sort of running the offense through him.
No, that's a good call. I didn't even think of that. That's really good.
Yeah, so, I mean, Mitch Robinson, I mean, to me, at least from my vantage point, he can be up and down, but he's a player that should excel with Tom Thibodeau. I'm not surprised as someone like Austin Rivers and Nerlens Noel having okay-ish seasons, or at least Tom Thibodeau type players. So from that point of view, the fact that he just lifts the baseline of the team, makes them competent, will get them to compete. The Knicks actually being an above-average defense, a top 10 defense, I mean, that in itself should be enough to build a statue of the man.
No, it's absurd. It's absurd. Yeah. They were 24th, 25th last year. I mean, it's the same. It's essentially the same personnel. So
exactly, and we feel very similarly about Billy Donovan right now in Chicago, because the Bulls are a top. Wow. I think they're 15th in the NBA at this point in offensive rating, whereas last season, if we weren't 30th, we were 29th. So, and again, with the same personnel. So it's very similar situations, going back to what you sort of said at the top of the podcast. There are parallels to the point where, you're maybe not getting in the best NBA coach. You're getting in a flawed NBA coach, a coach who probably is only good for maybe 3 to 4 seasons and eventually will run his time. But during that time period, he will build your team back up to some sort of respectability. There will be flaws there. There will be problems that you have. Obviously, the minutes will be a thing that continues to stay with Tibbs, and maybe the fact that he leans on some veterans at times. But I mean, I've always laughed at the notion that the guy never plays his rookies or never plays young guys, because he always did that in Chicago, assuming those young guys were prepared to play and were actually good enough to play. Well, I mean, yeah, there was games where he was closing games with a rookie, not a rookie Taj Gibson, but a second year Taj Gibson.
Isn't that the year he led the NBA in 4 quarter minutes? I think one of those years when he was coming off the bench, he did.
There would be games where he would bench Joakim Noah and Carlos Boozer and close games with Amir Rashik and Taj Gibson, 2 youngish guys. Jimmy Butler didn't necessarily play his first season, but he emerged under Tom Thibodeau. Obviously, Derrick and Joakim Noah and some of these younger guys sort of emerged under Tibbs. So if you can play and you can play defense, you will play for Tom Thibodeau. So I've always that's always annoyed me. But look, I'm a Tibbs fan. I'm happy to see him sort of having this bounce back, particularly how poorly things sort of ended for him in Minnesota. But I think Knicks fans should be loving the Thibodeau era, flaws and all.
Listen, no one's perfect, right? And far be it from any person in our position to fault someone in a position like Tibbs or Billy Donovan. Maybe we could fault Jim Boylan and David Fisdale. That's another thing we have in common. We had the worst coaches.
That is true. Yeah,
to start that season. Oh, those were good times. Do you guys still have the leadership council? What was that?
The council or committee, I can't remember, but it was some sort of ridiculous thing. That's long gone. That's gone with Boylan, thankfully. But another parallel between the two organizations, like bad regimes and bad ownership, allowing these sorts of things to fester for too long. And thankfully, it's changed, and hopefully it's the dawning of a brighter day for both teams. Yeah,
I completely agree. Last thing before I get you out of here, I got to do another one of these because I want to talk about Patrick Williams. We'll do that another time. I'm very high on Patrick Williams, and he looked pretty good in limited usage last night, but I'm impressed. Is there because here in New York, we're always thinking, okay, what's next? Who's the next guy we could get? Do we need to tank to get the guy? Whatever it is. What is the next thing that you think the Bulls need to do, or you would like to see the Bulls do, over the next, 6 months, year, 18 months that you think, okay, maybe do you think it's going to be multiple big moves, or do you think maybe they're like one big move and some internal development away? Like, what lies ahead?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many variables here at play specifically for the Bulls. I mean, previously coming into this season, I thought maybe free agency may be a relevant point to consider for the Bulls. If the team could maybe get to some level of respectability, maybe they could attract a free agent. But with so many of the guys that were meant to be free agents signing extensions, the free agency market doesn't look that great for the Bulls at this point. So I don't really know if that's an option. They got a decision looming on Lauri Markkanen and to a lesser degree Zach LaVine, like we sort of spoke about.
I didn't ask about Lauri. Do you want to give Lauri the bag?
Definitely not the bag. Definitely not the bag. I'm very cautious of what he's doing at the moment. He's gone through these hot streaks before, and he's had samples of 10 to 15 games where he's looked like this level of player. And for whatever reason, he just gets up against the Knicks. For whatever reason, he's always been good against the Knicks. So I'm cautiously optimistic, but at the same time, very wary of giving Lauri Markkanen his next contract based on what I've seen. A very inconsistent player, let's say a streak shooter. So that's going to be an interesting situation, but the time is ticking there. They can offer Zach an extension this offseason, whether they feel he's worth that next level player. I mean, we already spoke about that, but they're kind of at the crossroads at this point. This rebuild has been going for 3-4 years, so they have to start making decisions. And from my vantage point, I'd probably rather them not play the draft game anymore, unless, best case scenario is you sort of compete for the play-in tournament. Maybe you don't necessarily get in there. Maybe even you do. Maybe you finish with the 10th or 11th worst record, but you jump into the top four and you get a play like that rather than selling off pieces and going in on the all-out tank.
You had the 8th or 9th?
I think it was the 9th best odds at that point, 1.7% chance. So I'm obviously not suggesting we repeat that sort of situation, but with the odds being flattened, I mean, there is more scope for that happening. We saw last, I mean, even the Bulls jumped up from 8th, I think, last season to 4th. or 7th to 4th, whatever it was. So that they jumped up a number of spots.
They jumped the Knicks, so they I think it was 8th. Anyway.
Yeah, so I mean, I just want to see them building at this point. I want to see them adding pieces around Zach. I don't necessarily want to see them trade off Zach LaVine. If anything, I'd rather see them trade off guys like Kobe and Lowry and sort of start adding around Zach. And the thing that I'm on at the moment is maybe trading for Brad Beal and trying to be a smaller gunning team. Like I mentioned Portland before. Like, I mean, if the Bulls could be a version of Portland in the Eastern Conference, I'd take that at this point, given how bad things have been there, the last 5 to 6 years. So I'm hopeful that this new regime starts looking at the trade market as an avenue of improving this team. That's certainly something that never really happened under Garpax. I could count maybe on one hand how many trades they made that actually improved the team. Often when they did make trades, it was to salary dumps or to make the team worse to try to tank, let's say. So I want to see them be a little bit more creative, and I want to see them actually act like a big market for a change. This is Chicago. We haven't been relevant for a long damn time. Start acting like a big market and start swinging for some of these good players. So that would be the way I'm thinking about it. But I mean, it's all variable based depending on how things sort of shake out. We could go a number of ways here. So it's going to be fun and interesting to watch.
Yeah, I'm curious to watch it from afar. The Beal thing is fascinating. Man, if they could get that dude without giving up Patrick Williams.
Yeah, I mean, if you can get Bradley Beal, who has a connection to Billy Donovan, if you can get him for Kobe White, Larry Markkinen, and maybe a couple of picks, let's say, and maybe you have to throw in Otto Porter from a contract standpoint, I'm doing that deal. I don't know if the Wizards are, but that's the bag I'm on lately.
We're again, there's a lot of Knicks fans who would like for them to go all in for Beal, and I think you guys are in an advantageous position where you have a few more tradable pieces than we do right now, and it's and also I think, as you said really well, you guys are maybe under the gun a little bit more in terms of the timing. So I think it probably makes more sense. This was a lot of fun. I really do love talking to people who cover other teams and getting different perspectives because I feel like it makes me a smarter fan. Mark, can you tell folks where, even though I said at the top, can you tell folks where they can find you?
Yeah, look, if your listeners have any desire to tune into Bulls stuff, they can follow me on Twitter at MKHoops. I also do a Bulls podcast on the Blue Wire Network, Bulls HQ. So that is my podcast that I'm generally getting on every week talking about the Bulls. But if I'm not podcasting, then I'm on Twitter pretty much 24/7 talking about the Bulls. So you can find me at those two spots. I
would wish you luck in the game on Wednesday night, but the Knicks need to win.
You're lying.
I would be lying. They've lost 5 of 6, and I kind of do not want to. Julius Randle even said after the game, I think he said the words "must win," which is that's a little early for that, but that's okay. I appreciate it.